Sometimes the person who changes the whole shape of your life is someone you almost walk past without noticing at all. The morning bus to Ridgeview Public Library ran late, which was how Samuel Doyle ended up standing under the awning of a coffee shop he couldn't afford, holding his son's hand a little tighter than usual. "Are we going to be late for story hour?" 7-year-old Theo asked, tugging at the strap of his backpack, which had a cartoon dinosaur stitched onto the front pocket, a birthday gift from 2 years ago that Samuel still hadn't found the heart to replace, even though the zipper barely held. "We've got time," Samuel said, though he wasn't sure that was true. Samuel worked nights stocking shelves at a hardware store on the edge of town, which left his mornings free for exactly one thing: making sure Theo got where he needed to go. His wife, Rachel, had passed when Theo was 3, a fast, cruel illness that had taken 11 months from diagnosis to funeral. 11 months Samuel still sometimes replayed at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. In the years since, he had rebuilt his life around a single rule, that his son would never once feel like an inconvenience, even if it meant Samuel himself went without sleep, without new boots, without much of anything. He'd been offered a foreman position at the hardware store's distribution center the year before, better pay, real benefits, a title that meant something on paper. He'd turned it down without telling anyone why. The hours would have meant a stranger picking Theo up from school 3 days a week, and Samuel had already decided, somewhere in a hospital hallway years earlier, that there were certain things money couldn't buy back once you'd traded them away. The bus finally came. They rode it in comfortable silence, Theo's forehead pressed to the window, watching the town blur past. Samuel watched him instead of the road, the way he often did, memorizing the shape of his son's face at 7 the way he'd once memorized the shape of his wife's handwriting on grocery lists, because he'd learned the hard way that you never know which ordinary morning you'll want back later. Ridgeview's new library wing had opened that spring, funded almost entirely by a foundation nobody in town had ever heard much about, the Amara Whitlock Foundation, named for the woman who ran it. She was, by most accounts, difficult to picture. The daughter of a shipping magnate who had built her own investment firm from nothing but a business degree and a refusal to lose. People who worked for her described her as sharp, exacting, and almost never seen without a folder of numbers in her hand. What almost nobody knew was that Amara had grown up 2 towns over, in a house where the library card was the only thing that felt limitless. Her father's shipping business had gone through 3 near collapses before it finally caught, years when the electricity got shut off twice and her mother sewed her school uniforms from fabric remnants. And in the gap between one bankruptcy and the next, the public library was the one place that never once asked what her family could afford. She had promised herself, somewhere around age 11, sitting on a step stool reshelving her 5th stack of returned paperbacks because the librarian quietly let her volunteer off her overdue fines instead of paying them, that if she ever had enough money to matter, she'd spend some of it making sure no kid ever had to feel what she'd felt standing at that counter, doing the math on 35 cents she didn't have. She had never told this to anyone at the foundation. It was easier to let people assume her giving came from comfort rather than memory. She came to the ribbon cutting that morning not to be photographed, though the photographers came anyway, but because she wanted, just once, to see a child open a book in a room her mother's old library finds could never have afforded. She was standing near the new releases shelf, half listening to a councilman thank her for the 3rd time, when a small voice cut cleanly through the noise. "Excuse me, is this one good?" Theo was holding up a paperback with a cracked spine, a well-loved book about a boy who could talk to storms. Amara knelt without thinking about it, a habit she didn't know she still had. "That one's about a boy who isn't afraid of the things that scare everyone else," she said. "I think you'll like the ending. Dad says the ending is the most important part. He says you can tell if a story's any good by how it treats the people in it at the end." Amara glanced up and found Samuel a few feet away, waiting with the particular patience of someone used to not being noticed in a room. He gave her an apologetic nod, the universal signal of a parent bracing to collect a chatty child. "He doesn't bother anyone," she said. "He asked a fair question." "He does that. Sorry. Theo, come on, let's find our seats." Theo went, but not before pressing the paperback into Amara's hands. "You should read it too," he said, as if it were obvious. "Grown-ups forget how sometimes." Amara stood there a moment longer than the interaction required, the paperback still warm from Theo's hands, and something in her chest did a small, unfamiliar thing she didn't have a word for yet. She didn't mean to go back. She told herself the second visit, 3 days later, was about inspecting the new reading nook her foundation had paid for. The third visit, she didn't bother explaining to herself at all. It was on that third visit that she found Samuel on his knees in the children's section, a small toolkit open beside him, tightening a bolt on a bookshelf that had been wobbling since the wing opened. "You work here?" she asked. "No," he said, not looking up. "I just noticed it was loose. Figured somebody's kid was going to get a shelf on their head eventually. The library's maintenance contract comes on Thursdays. Today's Tuesday." She almost laughed. It had been a long time since anyone had corrected her so plainly, without flattery folded into it. "I'm Amara," she said, and left off the last name, curious what would happen if she did. "Samuel," he finally looked up, wiping his hand on his jeans before offering it. "You're the one who talked books with my son." "Guilty." "He doesn't stop once he starts, fair warning." "I don't mind," she said, and meant it more than the sentence let on. Over the weeks that followed, Amara found reasons to be at the library on the mornings Theo had story hour. She told herself it was oversight, then stopped bothering to explain it at all. She learned that Samuel worked nights and slept in patches, that she'd once wanted to study engineering before Rachel's illness and the hospital bills rearranged his life, that he fixed things not because anyone asked him to, but because walking past something broken bothered him more than fixing it cost him. She learned that Theo collected bottle caps because his mother used to, that he believed libraries were the only place rich and poor books get treated the same, a phrase Samuel later admitted, red-faced, that he'd said once in the car and hadn't realized his son was listening. She learned, too, in smaller pieces, the shape of what Samuel didn't say, that the boots he wore were the only pair he owned, resold twice at a cobbler 2 towns over because it was cheaper than replacing them, that he skipped dinner more nights than he let on, telling Theo he'd already eaten at work, that there was a version of his life, somewhere back before the diagnosis and the funeral, where he might have built bridges or wind turbines instead of stocking shelves at midnight, and that he never once said this like a complaint, only like a fact he'd made peace with a long time ago. And Samuel, without quite meaning to, learned things about Amara too. That she ate lunch most days, standing up, out of habit rather than necessity. That she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone called her generous, as though the word landed somewhere that didn't fit. That she asked Theo more questions in a single afternoon than most adults asked children in a year, and actually waited for the answers, crouching down to his height instead of talking over him. One Thursday, when a sudden downpour trapped all 3 of them under the library's front overhang, Theo announced with total confidence that thunder was just the sky clearing its throat, and Amara laughed so suddenly and so genuinely that she surprised herself. Samuel watched her laugh with an expression he didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. Trouble, when it finally came, arrived on 2 fronts at once, one from Amara's world and one from Samuel's, though neither of them knew about the others until much later. A board member of Amara's foundation, a man named Preston Cole, who had never once approved of a decision he hadn't made himself, cornered her after a donor lunch. "The library thing plays well," he said, swirling the ice in his glass. "The whole struggling town boy makes good story. We should get a photographer on it. Maybe feature the janitor angle. People eat that up. Humble billionaire, humble town, humble help. Writes itself." "He's not the janitor," Amara said, feeling something cold settle behind her ribs. "Everyone's an angle, Amara. That's how funding works. Half our major donors this quarter cited the library initiative specifically. If we can put a face to it, a real working-class face, we could double that by spring." "Drop it, Preston." He smiled the particular smile of a man who has already decided not to. And Amara, the board's been asking questions about how much time you're personally spending on one branch library, just so you're aware. That last part landed harder than she let herself show. Preston Cole did not make idle comments. He made them because they were useful later. Around the same time, on the other side of town, Samuel's foreman at the hardware store called him into the back office to tell him, not unkindly but without much room for negotiation, that the store's parent company was cutting night shifts by a third starting the following month. Samuel would keep his job, but at 2/3 his usual hours, which meant, doing the math on the drive home, that the modest cushion he'd spent 2 years building back up after Rachel's medical bills would be gone again inside of 4 months. He didn't tell Amara. He didn't tell anyone. He simply started picking up whatever extra work he could find, hauling for a moving company on weekends, patching drywall for a neighbor 2 streets over, and told Theo, when his son asked why he was more tired than usual, that grown-ups just got tired sometimes, which was true enough not to feel like a lie. By the time Amara found Samuel again, he'd already heard a garbled version of the Foundation conversation from a volunteer who'd overheard the tail end of it and repeated it with all the wrong emphasis. He was quieter than usual, polite in the specific way people are polite when they've decided to protect themselves. "I heard your Foundation's thinking of a story about the library. Real inspiring, I bet. Working dad, brave kid, all that." "That's not what I want," Amara said. "Doesn't much matter what you want if it's already decided," Samuel said. And there was no anger in it, only a tiredness Amara recognized from her own reflection some mornings. "I've been somebody's story before. After Rachel died, a local paper wanted to run something. Brave young widower. They took our picture at the cemetery without asking, printed it next to an ad for a mattress sale. Usually ends with people feeling good about themselves and me feeling like the moral of it. I turned it down the moment I heard it. I told him to drop it." "I believe you," Samuel said, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't. "Doesn't change how it felt hearing about it secondhand before you got the chance to tell me yourself." He didn't come back to the library that week, or the one after. Theo still came, dropped off by a neighbor on the days Samuel picked up extra shifts, and every time Amara saw him without his father beside him, something in her chest tightened in a way spreadsheets had never once managed. She kept working. She sat through board meetings and donor calls and a tense closed-door conversation with Preston Cole that ended with her formally removing him from the library initiative's oversight entirely, a decision that cost her politically in ways she didn't fully register until later and didn't regret for a single moment. Preston did not take the removal quietly. He began in small and deniable ways, raising questions with other board members about Amara's judgment, her focus, whether her attention had drifted from the Foundation's larger portfolio toward one town, one library, one family, as he put it to anyone who would listen. None of it filled the particular quiet that had opened up where Tuesday mornings used to be. It was Theo, in the end, who fixed what the adults couldn't. He found Amara at the front desk on a rainy Thursday, soaked from the walk, clutching a drawing instead of a book. "Theo doesn't know I came alone," he admitted. "I told the neighbor I forgot something." "Theo, that's a 15-minute walk in the rain," Amara started. "I had an umbrella," he said, as though this settled the matter entirely. He held out the drawing before she could argue further. It showed 3 figures under a roof made of books instead of shingles. Underneath, in crayon block letters, "Where we fit." "He thinks you think we're a project," Theo said, matter-of-fact the way only children manage to be about the things adults spend years avoiding. "But he doesn't say that. He just gets quiet. He's been quiet for 2 weeks. He still makes my lunch and reads to me and everything, but it's a different kind of quiet than before. I know the difference. And he's been doing extra jobs on weekends. He thinks I don't notice, but I count how many days he doesn't eat breakfast." That last detail stayed with Amara long after Theo had gone home. She hadn't known about the hours being cut. Samuel had never once mentioned it. "Can I keep this?" she asked, looking at the drawing. "You have to bring it back yourself," Theo said. "That's the rule." "What rule?" "The one I just made up," Theo admitted, unashamed, "but it's still a rule." She found Samuel on his porch that evening, the rain slowing to a drizzle, a mug of coffee going cold in his hands. He looked up when her car door shut, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Your son negotiates like he learned it from someone," Amara said, holding up the drawing as she came up the walk. Samuel almost smiled beside himself. "He gets that from his mother. Rachel could talk a hardware store into a discount on things that weren't even on sale." "I turned down the photographer," Amara said. "I turned down the story. Not because it wouldn't play well, because you were right to be angry. I've spent my whole career being careful with numbers and careless with people, and I didn't notice I was doing it again until a 7-year-old had to point it out to me with a crayon." Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning the mug in his hands. "I've spent a lot of years making sure nobody could look at us and see a headline," he said finally. "After Rachel died, people wanted to help in ways that made me feel smaller, not bigger. Charity baskets left on the porch with cards that said things like, 'Stay strong.' A church group that wanted to feature Theo in a newsletter about resilience. He was 4. He didn't need to be resilient in a newsletter. He needed somebody to make his lunch. It's hard to trust when somebody looks at us and sees something else instead of just us." "What do you see when you see us?" Amara asked, coming up 2 steps, close enough now that she didn't have to raise her voice. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his shoulders finally eased. "Honestly, I see a kid who found a friend before either of the adults figured out what to call it. And I see somebody who knelt down on a library floor to talk to a 7-year-old about a book when she didn't have to, and didn't stop showing up after." "That's not a very impressive thing to be seen as." "It's the only kind I trust," Samuel said. "Your hours got cut," she said. "It wasn't a question. Theo told me. He counts your skipped breakfasts." Samuel looked away, jaw tight. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to become a thing you fixed for me. That's exactly the trap I keep telling you I don't want to fall into." "I'm not offering to fix it," Amara said. "I'm offering to sit here while you figure out how you're going to fix it, which is a different thing entirely, and one I think you'd let a friend do." He looked at her for a long moment, and something loosened behind his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'd let a friend do that." She sat down on the step beside him, not asking permission, and he didn't move away. They sat on the porch until the rain stopped completely, saying very little, which for the first time in weeks felt like enough. At some point, his hand found hers on the step between them, and neither of them mentioned it, the way you don't mention the most important thing in a room for fear of making it smaller by naming it. The library's autumn book fair arrived 2 weeks later, strung with warm lights and paper lanterns that swayed gently over the courtyard. Long tables held homemade jam, second-hand paperbacks sorted by color instead of genre because a volunteer had thought it looked nicer, and a small stage where the children's choir would sing before the raffle. Samuel came with Theo just after sunset, carrying a pie Theo had insisted on baking himself, which meant it was slightly burned on one side, and Samuel loved it anyway. Amara had spent the whole afternoon greeting donors and thanking volunteers, but she found herself watching the gate more than the stage. When she finally saw the 2 of them come through it, something in her chest loosened for the first time all week. They fell into step easily now, the awkwardness of the porch conversation worn smooth by weeks of ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays. Theo ran off toward a beanbag toss with 2 classmates, promising to find them by the closing story, and Samuel and Amara wandered the tables at the unhurried pace of people who no longer needed a reason to be near each other. "You never told me what happened to the engineering degree," Amara said, picking up a jar of blackberry jam and setting it back down. "Life happened to it," Samuel said. "Rachel got sick the semester before I would have finished my core courses. Then Theo. Then it just never seemed like the kind of thing you go back to." "Seems like exactly the kind of thing you go back to." He looked at her sideways. "You planning something?" "I don't plan things," Amara said. "I just notice them and let people trip over the noticing eventually." He laughed, an actual laugh, unguarded, and for a moment the 2 of them simply stood there in the string lights, neither one in a hurry to be anywhere else. It was the choir director's voice over the small speaker system calling all children to the reading garden for the closing story that reminded them of the time. They walked toward the oak tree together, and it was only once they arrived that they realized Theo wasn't there. Samuel didn't panic, not yet. He probably went to finish his stamp card, he said, scanning the tables. Amara was already moving toward the volunteers near the raffle booth, asking in a calm, clear voice if anyone had seen a boy in a navy hoodie with a dinosaur backpack. Nobody had, not in the last 20 minutes. They split up without discussing it, the way people do when they've quietly begun trusting each other's judgment. Samuel checked the gymnasium and the art tables, his heart climbing steadily into his throat with every empty room. Amara checked the library stacks in the parking lot, forcing her voice to stay level each time she asked a stranger the same question. It was in the small greenhouse behind the science garden, glass walls glowing faintly gold from the lights strung along its frame, that she finally found him. Theo was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor beside a much younger boy who was crying softly, a paper raffle ticket crumpled in his fist. Theo was reading aloud from a battered adventure paperback, his voice pitched low and steady, the way his father read to him. "He got separated from his grandma," Theo explained, not looking up from the page. "Stories help, Dad says." Amara knelt beside them both, throat tight in a way she didn't examine too closely, and helped find the boy's grandmother 2 tables over, frantic with worry that dissolved in relief the moment she saw him. When Samuel found them a few minutes later, he didn't say anything about the fear that had been sitting in his chest for the last 10 minutes. He just put a hand on his son's shoulder and let it rest there a beat longer than usual. Walking back toward the festival lights together, Theo between them holding one of each of their hands without being asked, Amara understood something she hadn't let herself say out loud yet. She had spent her whole career building things that scaled: companies, funds, forecasts. But nothing she had ever built had made her feel the way this small, ordinary family did, walking unhurried under string lights toward a story that was almost over. The setback, when it came from Preston Cole, and it came in November. He had spent 2 months quietly building a case, and he made it formally at the Foundation's winter board meeting, that Amara's personal involvement with a beneficiary family represented a conflict of interest, that continued funding of the Ridgeview branch should be reviewed by an independent committee, and that, delivered with a thin, practiced smile, perhaps it was time the board considered whether Amara's judgment on discretionary grants needed additional oversight going forward. It was not technically an attack on Samuel and Theo. It was worse, in its way, a bloodless procedural attempt to make Amara choose between the foundation she'd built and the 2 people who had, without either of them realizing it, become the center of her life. She fought it the only way she knew how, with numbers. She walked the board through the literacy gains at the Ridgeview branch, the 2 additional grants the initiative had unlocked from outside donors, the fact that not $1 of foundation money had ever touched Samuel Doyle's household directly. She did not mention the porch, or the crayon drawing, or the greenhouse. Some things, she'd learned, you protected by not putting them on a slide. The vote to review her discretionary authority failed 7-2. Preston Cole resigned 2 weeks later before the board could act on the whispered suggestion that perhaps his own judgment ought to be reviewed instead, given how much of the November meeting had been spent relitigating a decision that was never really about governance at all. Samuel never learned the details of that fight. Amara never told him. Some kinds of protecting, she decided, you did quietly, the way he'd once tightened a bolt on a bookshelf without waiting to be thanked for it. Winter came slowly that year, the way it does in towns that don't quite decide what season they're in until December. Amara started showing up on Thursdays too, not just Tuesdays, and eventually stopped pretending there was a foundation reason for either of them. Theo took to introducing her at Story Hour as, "My dad's friend Amara, she's basically a librarian now," which was not remotely true, and which Amara never once corrected. The foundation quietly funded 2 more branch libraries that spring, neither of which got a press release, both of which Amara visited in person unannounced, the way she'd learned to prefer doing things. Samuel's hours at the hardware store were restored in January, when the parent company reversed its cuts after a stronger-than-expected quarter, and he used the unexpected breathing room to finally enroll in the engineering course he'd once given up on. 2 nights a week at the community college, sitting in the back row with a coffee thermos and a stack of secondhand textbooks. Amara watched Theo on those nights, not because anyone asked her to, but because it had stopped feeling like a favor to either of them a long time ago. She helped him with his reading homework at the kitchen table, and somewhere in the middle of February, without either of them deciding it formally, she simply stopped going home most nights before Theo's bedtime. There was one evening deep in that winter when Theo came down with a fever bad enough that Samuel sat up with him until 3 in the morning, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead the way he'd once done for Rachel in her last months. Amara showed up at 7, unannounced, with a bag of groceries and a thermometer she'd bought on the way, and didn't ask permission before setting a pot of soup on the stove. Samuel, gray with exhaustion, watched her move through his kitchen like she already knew where everything was and understood, in the plain, unglamorous way real things get understood, that whatever this had become, it wasn't temporary anymore. "You didn't have to come," Samuel said, not looking up from the soup. "I know. I wanted to," Amara said, not looking up from the soup. The library added a small plaque near the reading nook the following spring, not for a donor and not for the foundation. It read simply, "For the ones who fix what's broken without waiting to be asked." Nobody outside of the three of them ever knew exactly who it was for. Theo liked it that way. He said the best stories were the ones you had to notice for yourself. On the afternoon it was installed, the three of them stood in front of it together, Theo in the middle holding both their hands the way he had, without asking, taken to doing over the winter. A librarian passing by smiled at them, the way people smile at things they don't fully understand but recognize as good anyway. "You know," Amara said quietly, "I used to think the biggest thing I'd ever built was a company." "And now?" Samuel asked. She looked down at Theo, who was already tugging them both toward the new releases shelf, entirely uninterested in sentiment when there were books to be read. "Now I think I had it backwards the whole time. The company was never going to be the thing anyone remembered me for. This might be." Samuel squeezed her hand once, said nothing, and let Theo pull them both toward the shelves, because some answers didn't need saying out loud to be understood. Years later, the plaque was still there, a little more weathered, the bench beside it worn smooth by generations of small hands. New families would ask the librarians who it was for, and the librarians, who most of whom hadn't been there at the beginning, would shrug and say they weren't entirely sure. Only that every year, without fail, a man who still smelled faintly of sawdust, a woman who still carried a folder she rarely opened, and eventually a grown son with his own dog-eared paperback, came by every spring to sit on that same bench for a little while, saying very little, which had always been enough. If there's someone in your life you've been quietly grateful for but never quite said so, the neighbor who shovels your walk, the coworker who covers your shift, the person who fixes things without being asked, this week might be a good week to tell them, not for a headline, just for them.